Something you did quietly in the past has just come back to your soulmate, and they were completely unprepared for what they discovered. Not because it was something dramatic, not because you ever asked anyone to recognize it, but because you made a choice that affected them without ever telling them the truth behind it. Your soulmate has been looking at certain memories for a long time and believing they understood what happened. But now, one missing piece has finally appeared, and it is changing the meaning of everything. And listen carefully, because this is not about a simple favor or an ordinary act of kindness. There was something you did when nobody was watching, something you deliberately kept to yourself because you never wanted your actions to become a reason for someone to feel obligated to you. At the time, you may have thought it was better that they never knew. You may have believed that if helping them meant you had to remain invisible, then you were willing to accept that. But your soulmate has now discovered part of that story, and they are struggling to understand why you never told them. Suddenly, moments that once seemed random are beginning to look completely different. A situation they thought resolved itself may not have happened by chance. A door they thought simply opened may have been connected to something you quietly did. A difficult moment they thought they survived alone may have involved a choice you made behind the scenes. And the more they connect these pieces, the more unsettled they become. Because they are beginning to realize that while they were living through those moments, you may have been protecting something for them without asking for recognition. You didn't announce it. You didn't use it to gain sympathy. You simply did what you believed needed to be done and carried the truth away with you. But now that truth has found its way back to them, and there is one question they cannot stop asking. What could possibly have made you sacrifice something of your own for them and then remain completely silent about it? The more your soulmate thinks about what they have discovered, the more pieces of the past begin falling into place, and that is what is affecting them so deeply right now. At first, they may have wanted to believe it was simply a misunderstanding, something that had been exaggerated or remembered differently over time. But then they started connecting the details. They remembered moments when something unexpectedly worked out for them, moments when a difficult situation suddenly became easier, moments when they wondered why you behaved a certain way and never received a clear explanation. Back then, those things may have seemed like coincidences. Now they are beginning to wonder whether you were quietly involved in making some of those things possible. And listen to this, because the part they are struggling with isn't only what you did. It is the fact that you never used it to make yourself important in their life. You could have told them. You could have waited for gratitude. You could have reminded them of your sacrifice whenever they misunderstood you. But you didn't. You allowed them to believe that certain things simply happened, even when you knew the truth. That realization is forcing your soulmate to look at your character differently. They are beginning to understand that you weren't trying to collect emotional debts. You weren't helping them so they would owe you something later. You weren't secretly keeping score. You simply cared enough to do something that mattered and then let them continue living without knowing how much you had actually done. And suddenly your silence has a completely different meaning. They may remember times when you seemed distant after helping them, and now they wonder whether that distance came from knowing you couldn't explain everything without revealing the sacrifice. They may remember moments when you appeared strangely calm during situations that should have affected you, and now they wonder whether you were carrying information they never had. Even your smallest reactions may suddenly seem important. The soulmate is beginning to understand that sometimes the person doing the most behind the scenes is the person saying the least about it. And this discovery may be making them emotional because they realize how easily they could have missed the entire thing. They were looking for obvious signs, obvious words, obvious proof, while you were showing care in a way that required no applause. Perhaps you protected them from something they never knew was coming. Perhaps you gave up an opportunity because you believed it would benefit them more. Perhaps you defended them when they weren't there to defend themselves. Perhaps you quietly solved a problem and then stepped away before anyone could ask who had done it. Whatever form that hidden act took, the meaning behind it is becoming clearer. You cared about their well-being, even when you had no guarantee that they would understand you afterward. And now, your soulmate is asking themselves why someone would do that without expecting anything in return. That question is leading them toward an even deeper realization. Maybe what you did wasn't about keeping them close at all. Maybe you were willing to help them, even if helping them meant they eventually moved forward without you. And that is the part they were never prepared to discover, because it suggests that your feelings were not based on possession or recognition. You simply wanted something good for them, even if you couldn't be the person standing beside them when it happened. Now they are beginning to see that the quietest thing you ever did may have been one of the most meaningful things they will ever learn about you. But there is still one part of the story they haven't fully understood yet, and when they discover what that choice actually cost you, the emotions they are feeling now may become much harder to contain. And this is where the discovery becomes much deeper, because your soulmate is no longer simply realizing that you did something for them. They are beginning to understand what that decision actually cost you, and that changes the entire meaning of the story. At first, they may have imagined that whatever you did was easy for you, something you could do without thinking twice. But as more details come together, they're realizing that you had something of your own at stake. You didn't simply give them your time or attention. You may have given up an opportunity, accepted a difficult consequence, protected them from something that could have damaged their future, or deliberately stepped aside when you could have chosen yourself instead. And the part that affects them most is knowing that you made that choice without knowing whether they would ever find out. You had no guarantee that they would appreciate you, no guarantee that they would understand your intentions, no guarantee that the connection between you would even survive, yet you still made the decision. That is what your soulmate is struggling to comprehend now. They keep going back to the question of why. Why would you do something so significant and then remain silent? Why would you accept the emotional weight of a decision that nobody asked you to make? Why would you protect their peace while quietly carrying the consequences yourself? And slowly the answer is becoming clear. You weren't doing it because you expected something from them. You were doing it because, at that moment, their well-being mattered to you. That realization can be overwhelming because it forces your soulmate to reconsider what they believed your connection was. Maybe they thought the relationship was defined by conversations, attraction, memories, or moments you shared openly. Now they are realizing that some of the deepest parts of the connection may have existed in things they never saw. There may have been choices you made when they weren't present. There may have been sacrifices they never witnessed. There may have been moments when you protected them without allowing yourself to be seen as the person responsible. And now they are looking back at those years with a completely different understanding. They may remember a time when you could have spoken up but chose silence. A moment when you could have taken credit but allowed someone else to receive it. A situation where you could have made things easier for yourself, but instead chose the option that helped them. At the time, they may have misunderstood your behavior. Perhaps they thought you were being distant, confusing, unusually selfless, or simply difficult to read. Now they are beginning to understand that there may have been a reason behind every one of those choices. And that is when emotion starts replacing confusion, because your soulmate is realizing that you may have carried this secret for much longer than they ever imagined. You may have watched them move forward while knowing what you had done. You may have listened to them talk about their life without correcting their understanding. You may have even allowed them to believe that you didn't care as deeply as you actually did, because telling the truth would have made your sacrifice feel like a transaction. And you never wanted it to become that. You didn't want them to feel indebted to you. You didn't want them to stay because they felt guilty. You didn't want your kindness to become a chain that kept them connected to you. You wanted their freedom, even if their freedom meant you had to live with being misunderstood. That is a completely different kind of love, and your soulmate is beginning to recognize it. They are starting to see that what you did wasn't about being noticed. It was about making a choice when nobody was watching. And perhaps that is why the discovery is affecting them so strongly. Anyone can make a grand gesture when they know they will receive recognition. But you may have done something meaningful while believing you would never receive recognition at all. You may have accepted being misunderstood because protecting them mattered more than proving yourself. And now they are asking themselves whether they ever truly knew you. They thought they understood your heart. But this hidden part of your story reveals a side of you they never had access to. It shows patience. It shows restraint. It shows loyalty. It shows that your feelings were deeper than the words you were able to express. And now they have to sit with an uncomfortable truth. The person they may have underestimated was quietly doing something that could have changed their life. The person they may have thought had moved on without looking back may have been carrying a secret act of love that they never knew existed. And once that realization settles into their heart, they can't simply forget it. Because now they understand that your greatest act for them may have been the one you never intended them to discover. And the question that remains is not whether you cared. They are beginning to know that you did. The question now is whether they can live with knowing how much you gave without ever asking them for anything in return. Now that your soulmate knows what you did and is beginning to understand what it cost you, the emotional weight of the discovery is becoming much harder for them to carry. At first they were simply shocked. Then they became curious. Then they started connecting memories. But now something deeper is happening. They are beginning to realize that while they were living their life, making choices, moving through difficult moments, and trying to understand their own circumstances, you were quietly carrying a piece of their story that they never knew existed. And that realization can change the way someone remembers everything. Your soulmate may now be looking back at conversations that once seemed ordinary and wondering what you knew at the time. They may be remembering moments when you seemed unusually quiet, moments when you appeared emotional but didn't explain why, moments when you stepped away without giving them the complete reason. They may have interpreted those moments as distance, confusion, or even indifference. But now those memories have another meaning. They are beginning to wonder whether you were protecting them while simultaneously protecting yourself from the pain of revealing what you had done. And listen carefully, because this is where their emotions may become difficult to control. They are realizing that you didn't simply keep a secret. You carried the responsibility of that secret while watching them live without knowing how much you had done. You may have had countless opportunities to reveal the truth, yet you chose not to. You could have used that knowledge to prove that you cared. You could have told them during an argument. You could have brought it up when you felt misunderstood. You could have reminded them when they questioned your intentions, but you didn't, and now your soulmate understands why that silence matters. If you had told them immediately, they might have felt obligated to respond a certain way. They might have wondered whether your sacrifice came with expectations. They might have believed that you were trying to earn something from them. Instead, you allowed your action to remain what it truly was, something you chose to do because you cared. Nothing more, nothing less. That realization can create a strange mixture of emotions. Gratitude because they now know what you did. Sadness because they wish they had known sooner. Regret because they may have treated you differently if they had understood. And perhaps even guilt because they realized that you were carrying something meaningful while they were unaware of the emotional price you were paying. They may begin wondering how many times you were misunderstood because you refused to explain yourself. How many times did they assume you didn't care when, in reality, you were caring in a way they couldn't see? How many times did they judge your silence without knowing the truth behind it? And how many moments between you might have unfolded differently if they had understood what was happening beneath the surface? These questions can become difficult to escape because once someone discovers a hidden truth about the past, they start revisiting everything through that new understanding. Suddenly, the smallest details become significant. A sentence you once said, a decision you made, a moment when you refused to take credit, a time when you appeared to walk away without explaining why. Your soulmate may now realize that you were not trying to disappear from their life as much as you were trying to make sure they could move forward without carrying the consequences of your decision. And that is what makes this discovery so emotional. You may have been willing to let them misunderstand you if it meant they could have a better future. You may have accepted being the person who wasn't thanked, wasn't recognized, and wasn't even remembered for what you had done. That kind of sacrifice can be difficult for someone to process because it challenges the way they understand love. They may have believed love always announces itself, always asks to be seen, always wants recognition. But what you did may have shown them something different. Sometimes love is quiet. Sometimes it protects without explaining. Sometimes it gives without demanding. Sometimes it steps aside because the well-being of another person matters more than receiving credit. And now your soulmate is beginning to understand that the person they thought they knew had been carrying a much deeper story all along. They may even wonder whether you ever regretted doing it. They may wonder whether you wish they had known. And perhaps the hardest question is whether you still feel the same way today. Because they now know something they can never unknow. They know that somewhere in your past, when you could have chosen yourself completely, you chose to do something that helped them instead. And that knowledge is forcing them to confront the possibility that they may have underestimated your heart for a very long time. But the discovery hasn't only changed how they see the past, it is changing how they see the future. Because now they have to ask themselves what they should do with this truth. Should they finally tell you that they know? Should they explain what they are feeling? Should they remain silent because they believe you never wanted recognition? Or should they finally give you the one thing you may have never asked for, but perhaps deserved all along? Acknowledgement. And that question is becoming impossible for them to ignore. Because once someone finally understands the sacrifice behind your silence, pretending nothing happened becomes much harder than telling the truth. And now your soulmate is finally beginning to understand what this discovery truly means. Because the secret itself was never the most important part. What matters is what your choice revealed about your heart. They are realizing that you did something for them, without knowing whether you would ever receive recognition, gratitude, or even another moment with them. You didn't make that decision because you wanted them to owe you something. You didn't do it so they would eventually come back. You didn't do it so one day you could say, "Look what I sacrificed for you." You simply saw something that mattered, and when the moment came to choose, you chose to help them. That truth is what your soulmate is carrying now. They may be looking at you differently, even if they haven't told you yet. Because they finally understand that some of the things they once interpreted as distance were actually connected to feelings much deeper than they realized. And perhaps the most emotional part is knowing that you never needed them to know. You were willing to let the story remain unfinished from your perspective because your intention was never recognition. It was care. That is why this discovery may stay with them for a very long time. They may replay the moment when they first heard the truth. They may remember where they were, what they were doing, and how suddenly everything seemed to connect. They may start wondering how many other things about you they misunderstood. How many times did you choose silence because you didn't want to burden them? How many times did you protect their feelings while hiding your own? How many moments did you quietly choose what was best for them, even when it wasn't necessarily best for you? These questions may not have easy answers, but they are changing something inside them. Your soulmate is beginning to understand that genuine care doesn't always look like dramatic declarations. Sometimes it looks like a decision nobody notices. Sometimes it looks like stepping back. Sometimes it looks like allowing someone to believe they got through something on their own when you were quietly helping from the background. And now they finally know. Whether they choose to speak about it, reach out, or simply carry this realization privately is something only they can decide. But the meaning of what you did doesn't depend on what they do next. You already made that choice when it mattered. You already gave what you were willing to give. And perhaps that is the message your heart needs to hear too. You don't need someone to discover every sacrifice you made in order for those sacrifices to have meaning. You don't need recognition to prove that your intentions were genuine. Sometimes the most powerful things we do for another person are the things they never see. But if your soulmate has finally discovered this hidden part of your story, then one thing has changed forever. They can no longer look back at your connection and believe they knew the whole truth. They now understand that there was something you carried quietly, something you did when nobody was watching, and something that revealed more about your feelings than any confession ever could. Maybe that is why this discovery found them now. Not necessarily to make them chase you, not necessarily to guarantee a reunion, but to finally give them an understanding they didn't have before. You cared, you acted, you sacrificed, and you never demanded anything in return. Your soulmate may never be able to change the past, but they can finally see it clearly. And sometimes clarity arrives long after the moment that needed it most. So if this message resonates with you, remember this. The things you do from a genuine heart do not become meaningless simply because nobody sees them. Your kindness was real even when it was invisible. Your sacrifice mattered even when it remained unknown. And now, whether your soulmate says anything or not, they finally know that behind the person they thought they understood was someone who quietly cared enough to do something they never expected to discover.